Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Shape in the Fog. It was the middle of October, the kind of cold that made your breath puff in the air like cigarette smoke, thick and white, before vanishing into the night. We had been camping for 3 days near the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona, an area thick with stories, ancient and new. The trees there are twisted, their branches resembling gnarled fingers reaching up to claw at the sky. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now the thick, cold fog had rolled in like a tidal wave, swallowing the land whole. We were far from civilization, surrounded only by the whispering wind and the crackling campfire. I was sitting by the fire with 3 of my closest friends, Greg, Matt, and Sarah. We were telling jokes, the kind of bad ones you only tell when you're out in the middle of nowhere, under the stars, trying to keep the creeping unease of isolation at bay. The fire flickered and danced, casting long shadows that stretched and swayed like living things. Greg was the first to notice something. He had always been the type to stay vigilant, even in the most mundane of situations. I remember his eyes flicking to the dark edge of the camp, where the fog seemed to swallow everything whole. "Did you guys see that?" he whispered, his voice tight, strained. At first, none of us took him seriously. We were used to him being jumpy. Greg had a vivid imagination, always on the lookout for the next horror story to live. But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't just his usual paranoia. Something had caught his attention, something real. I followed his gaze, but all I could see was the thick, impenetrable fog swirling in on itself, like it was trying to hide something. We all sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. It sounded like whispers, like secrets being passed around in the dark. But there was something more, something that didn't belong. Then there was a figure, a shadow, moving in the mist just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote wandering too close to camp. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. It wasn't the erratic, jerky motion of a wild animal. It was fluid, unnaturally smooth, like a person trying to imitate an animal's movements but getting it wrong. The figure didn't scurry or sprint. It glided, almost as if it was floating just above the ground. My heart skipped a beat. Greg wasn't wrong. We all saw it now. The shadow was growing, stretching toward us like something alive, something aware of our presence. "Is that?" Matt's voice trailed off, and Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes wide. "Not an animal," I whispered. "It's something else." The figure moved closer, the fog swirling around it, thickening as if the air itself was bending to its will. It was tall, unnaturally tall, too tall for a human, and its proportions were off wrong. Its arms hung too low, swinging in an eerie, fluid motion. Its legs stretched unnaturally long, its body casting an impossibly thin shadow that danced with the flickering light of the fire. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with fear. My throat was dry, like I had swallowed sand. My fingers felt numb as I gripped the handle of the flashlight. The air around us felt heavy, charged with something dark. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Something, some force, kept me rooted to the spot. Then it froze. The creature stopped just beyond the light, as if it had noticed our gaze. The fog parted for a moment, just enough for us to get a glimpse of its face. I wish I hadn't seen it. Its face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mix of human and animal. Its skin was pale, almost sickly in the moonlight, stretched tightly over sharp bones. But it wasn't the skin that terrified me. It was the eyes. They were glowing, not with any natural light, but with a cold, unnatural gleam that seemed to pierce right through the fog, through the campfire, through me. They were eyes that didn't belong to any creature on this earth. They were the eyes of something ancient, something that had seen too much to be anything like human. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, as if studying us, the foolish humans who had dared to step into its territory. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like a physical pressure pressing down on my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The fog closed up around the spot where it had been standing, swallowing it whole. One moment it was there, and the next, it was as if it had never existed at all. We didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive, until Greg was the first to break it. "We need to go. Now." His voice wasn't shaking, but it didn't need to be. The urgency in his tone was enough. We didn't argue. We packed up quickly, fumbling with our gear, eyes darting nervously to the thickening fog that seemed to be closing in on us. The last thing I remember before we left the camp was the sound of a low, guttural laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It was a laugh that rumbled deep in my chest. Something so unsettling and wrong that it sent a jolt of pure fear through me. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the fog, from within the earth itself. The kind of laugh that comes from something that knows you're not going to make it out alive. We didn't look back as we hurried to the car, our breaths coming in sharp, panic gasps. We drove all the way home in silence, the fog from the reservation still clinging to our minds like a dream we couldn't escape. For days after, I heard it in my head, its laugh low and mocking, echoing in my ears as if it were right behind me. The image of its eyes haunted me in my sleep, but no matter how much I tried to shake it, the feeling of being watched never left. It stayed with me, a cold, invisible presence that followed me everywhere I went. That was over a year ago, but sometimes when the fog rolls in, thick and heavy, I still hear that laugh. And I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me to return. Story 2. The Voice in the Dark Woods. It's funny, isn't it, how the mind can be tricked into thinking it's safe when it's anything but. I used to walk those woods behind the cabin like it was my backyard, like the towering pines and whispering aspens were old friends. There was a time when I believed that nothing could harm me there. But that belief shattered the day I heard her voice in the trees, the voice that wasn't hers. I'd grown up in that little cabin tucked away in the New Mexico wilderness. It had been my sanctuary, my home, and to a kid with an overactive imagination, the forest was a playground full of secrets waiting to be discovered. My mom used to warn me about the stories, the skinwalkers she called them, but I never really took her seriously. They were just stories, passed down like folklore to keep kids from wandering too far, from going places they shouldn't. But I learned too late that some stories are meant to be believed. It was a late afternoon in late autumn when the forest felt a little different than usual. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows on the ground, stretching the trees like dark fingers reaching for the horizon. I'd planned to take a shortcut through the dense forest, a path I'd walked hundreds of times before, and I didn't expect anything to be different this time. It was familiar, routine, and so my mind stayed preoccupied, thinking about everything else but the forest itself. The air had a sharpness to it, a coolness that came with the changing seasons, and the crunch of dried leaves underfoot was the only sound I could hear at first. Then something changed. I noticed the quiet, the unnatural quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves just moments before, had fallen still. It was as if the world around me had taken a breath and held it. I should have turned back. I should have. But instead, I pressed on, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That's when I heard it. At first, it was soft, almost like the wind itself whispering, but it was too clear to be natural. The leaves moved, and then I heard it. A voice. Alex, it called, just above a whisper, but still so distinct. I froze. My name. The voice was warm, soothing, like the way my mom used to call me when I was a kid, when everything felt safe. I turned around, my heart racing in my chest. But there was no one. Nothing. Just the trees, standing still, waiting. I laughed to myself nervously. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. A stray branch, maybe brushing against another, mimicking a voice. Yeah, that's all it was. That's all it could be. I kept walking, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, an instinctive warning, the kind you get when something isn't right. And then again I heard it. Come here, Alex. It's okay, come closer. My blood ran cold. This time it was louder, more urgent. But it wasn't just any voice. It was her voice. The voice of my mother. The woman who had passed away 3 years ago, leaving me in a house full of memories that never quite felt the same after a funeral. Her voice, soft and familiar, reached out to me from the depths of the forest, as if she were standing right behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned, looking into the dense forest, the trees standing like silent witnesses. But there was no sign of anyone. No one. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse quickened. Please, Alex, I need you. The voice now trembled, desperate. That's when the fear gripped me. I knew something was terribly wrong. My instinct screamed for me to run, but my feet felt glued to the earth, as if the forest itself had reached out and held me in place. I knew this voice. It was my mother's voice, but it couldn't be her. My mind screamed that she was dead, buried 6 feet under, gone. This voice, this wasn't her. Still it called out, more frantic now. Alex, please, come here. Please. Something inside me snapped. The urge to run overtook my every thought. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I bolted through the trees, my heart hammering in my chest, the voice chasing me through the woods like a shadow in the dark. It grew louder, closer, as if it was right behind me. I could feel the breath of the words against the back of my neck, could almost hear the rustling of footsteps in the leaves behind me. I pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face, ignoring the rocks that made my ankles twist. My breath was ragged, and my vision blurred with panic. Just get to the cabin, just get to the cabin, just get to the cabin. I don't know how long I ran. Time didn't make sense. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and that damn voice, getting closer, never letting up, always calling for me, pleading for me to turn around. And then, just as I burst into the clearing near the cabin, I stopped. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, its shape distorted and wrong. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was both, and neither. Its limbs were long and twisted, moving in ways that no human could. And its eyes, they were the worst part. They glowed with an unnatural light, the yellow of a predator that had no business being in the woods in the world. For a moment, I stood there frozen, the figure locked in my gaze. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew what it was. A skinwalker. My breath caught in my throat. The stories my mother had told me when I was younger came rushing back. The warnings, the fear she had instilled in me. But this was no longer a story. This was real. I turned and ran, slamming the cabin door behind me with a force that made the entire structure shake. I locked every bolt, every latch, and pressed my back against the door, listening to the silence that followed. But I knew it was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch in the distance sent me into a panic. And through it all, I heard her voice, faint and soft, calling my name from the darkness. Alex, please, I need you. But I never went back. I never ventured into those woods again. And to this day, when I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I can still hear that voice. I know it wasn't my mother, but I don't know what it was. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. Story 3. The Skinwalker in my neighbor's yard. I've lived in the small, dusty town of Eldridge, Arizona, for as long as I can remember. It's the kind of place where the wind howls through the streets at night, and the silence can be so thick you can almost hear the past creeping up behind you. My neighbor, Mr. Lawson, was a fixture of that silence. He was an old man, gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a face that seemed to carry the weight of 100 stories. He'd been living in his weathered house at the end of the street for as long as anyone could recall. We weren't exactly close, but we'd chat over the fence every now and then. He was the kind of guy who kept to himself, but I liked him well enough. I'll never forget the night things changed. It was just past midnight, and I was in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The wind had kicked up, rattling the windows and making the trees outside sway like haunted figures. I wasn't sleeping well, but that wasn't unusual for me. The house was too quiet, too still. That's when I heard it, a loud bang, the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a string of sharp noises, thuds, like something was being dragged across the room. The kind of sound you'd expect if someone was rearranging furniture in a hurry, except it didn't sound quite right. It felt wrong. I lay there, frozen for a moment. It was coming from Mr. Lawson's house. I tried to brush it off, It could have been him, working on one of his late-night projects. The man was always tinkering with something, building strange contraptions, fixing things I couldn't even identify. He had his quirks, no doubt, but nothing about him ever seemed dangerous. Still, there was something about the noise that unsettled me, something about the rhythm of it that seemed unnatural. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. The banging continued for what felt like hours, a steady, rhythmic sound that gnawed at my nerves. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the night. The air outside was cool, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. I walked down the narrow street, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The streetlights flickered as I passed them, casting long, stretched out shadows on the pavement. When I reached Mr. Lawson's house, I felt a chill run up my spine. The front door was wide open. I paused for a moment, unsure whether I should go in. The place was dark, but the door hung there, waiting. I called out softly, "Mr. Lawson, you okay in there?" No answer. The silence that followed was deep, oppressive, like the world had decided to stop spinning just for a moment. I took a hesitant step inside, my breath catching in my throat. The house smelled wrong. It wasn't just the dust or the old wood. It was a deeper smell, something rotting, something that shouldn't have been there. I called again, louder this time. "Mr. Lawson? It's me, Tom." Still nothing. I walked farther into the house, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air felt heavier with each step I took. It wasn't like the familiar weight of silence I was used to. It felt alive somehow, like something was watching me. Then I saw it, a trail of blood. It wasn't just a smear or a few drops. It was a clear, deliberate path leading from the living room to the back door. My stomach turned, but I couldn't stop myself. I followed the trail, my mind racing, heart pounding in my chest. The blood was fresh. I reached the back door and hesitated before stepping outside into the yard. The moon hung high in the sky, casting everything in an eerie, silver glow. I could see the trail continued through the grass, leading toward the fence at the back of the yard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I walked, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I saw it, lying in the grass, twisted and mutilated, was what looked like an animal. I couldn't tell what it was at first. The body was so mangled, so shredded, that it was impossible to make out. Its fur had been torn off in patches, and the remaining skin was hanging in tatters. There was blood everywhere, a pool of it, dark and slick in the moonlight. But it wasn't the animal that froze me in place. It was the figure standing beside it. At first, I thought it was Mr. Lawson, but then I realized how wrong that was. The figure was too tall, way too tall, at least 7 feet or more. Its body was human, but its legs were long and bent in a way that no humans could be. Its arms hung down like branches, unnaturally long and sinewy, ending in claws. The head, that was the worst part. It had the head of a deer, but its eyes were wrong. They weren't the dull, dead eyes of a deer. These eyes glowed, bright, piercing red, staring right at me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I could feel the air shift. The wind stopped. The night grew still. I didn't dare move. I was paralyzed, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The thing took a step toward me. Its limbs twisted as it moved, unnatural, like they didn't belong to a creature that walked the earth. I could hear its breath, ragged and low, like it was struggling to hold onto some semblance of its human form. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other, but it felt like hours. Finally, the creature made a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. It stepped forward again, its red eyes never leaving mine. I don't know what snapped me out of my trance, but the next thing I knew, I was running. My feet pounded against the earth, my lungs burning with each breath as I fled back to my house. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was locked safely inside, my heart still hammering in my chest. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination or my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew better. A week later, the police found Mr. Lawson's body in the woods just beyond his property. His body was mutilated, just like the animal. His face had been torn apart, his limbs twisted in impossible angles. The report said it looked like an animal attack, but I knew better. That thing in the yard, it had come for him. I haven't been able to sleep since. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing red eyes staring at me from the shadows. I hear its growl, soft and low, just before I wake up in a cold sweat. I don't know what it was, whether it was the Skinwalker or something worse, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there watching, and I'm not sure who it will come for next.